So welcome back. This is a very challenging sort of slot of the day because people have had their lunches and now they're thinking maybe siesta time and what am I going to have for dinner later and what's the meaning of life. But it's great that you're here. Thank you so much. It's been very interesting to see the interest that people have on the DMA just 2 years in. It feels like we're only at the beginning of a conversation and it's really, really, really interesting. So with me today, Damian Collins, Senior Advisor at Geradin Partners, former Junior Minister for Tech and the digital Economy in the UK Department for Digital, Culture, Media and Sport. And we are going to talk about the DMA, the DMCC, the future of digital regulation, but we're going to travel a little bit back in time to the origins of it all. And I'm really curious to hear about your involvement in this subject to begin with. Takes us back to the origin, the conversations that you were having and how you were shaping some of the discussions on digital regulation in the UK in particular.
Thank you very much. Well, thank you. I'm sort of one of a number of people that have recently joined Geradin Partners, although I'm not a lawyer myself. My background is in public policy, having been in the UK Parliament for 14 years. And a lot of that time was spent as a member of the Digital Culture, Media and Sports Select Committee. I was there when Rupert Murdoch had the custard pie thrust in his face.
You were in the room?
I was in the room. And the thing I remember most about that was everyone was cleared out, apart from the lawyers, obviously. And and the lawyers saying, look, it's nearly finished. He's been doing this for like 3 hours. We should stop now. There was one more MP had questions. And he was being mopped down of the stuff on his jacket and face. And he just looked up, and the first thing he said, well, you know, a little bit of theatre never hurt. So I was there. I was a member of the committee for a number of years. I was then chair of the committee when we decided to investigate what we call disinformation and fake news. But we put us slightly ahead of the game when the Cambridge Analytica sort of scandal exploded, and we were really the first parliamentary committee in the world to get into that, to question the whistleblowers, and then ultimately Facebook and others as well. So when I hear people like Mark Andreessen and even Nick Clegg sort of throw around the word techlash to describe what they see as an almost sort of impulsive knee-jerk reaction against the big platforms, I feel if there were medals for the role you played in the techlash, I would have a small ribbon for my work in 2018, 2019. And that sort of, and what I think is interesting, the reason I mention it is what I think is interesting looking at the UK context is in terms of where did the DMCC come from, I would say that came from Jason Furman's review for the UK Treasury that George Osborne commissioned. In fact, the select committee I chaired, our report on disinformation and fake news, which really became a report about the principles of platform liability and regulation. Furman cites from that report in his report as well. And the idea, therefore, of platform liability, accountability, the role of independent regulators in gathering evidence, establishing a case, holding platforms to account, that started at the same time. It started sort of in the wake of Cambridge Analytica and other things that were happening. And it started both with a view on competition and user safety at the same time. But the principle of regulatory structures, independent regulators overseeing them, you know, investigatory powers, were all really there at the start of that process, which was, 7 years ago.
And you were, at that moment, you were at the pie moment, I love that, but you were also at the moment where with the mood shifted, when we were less naive about what platforms did or do, right?
Yes, and I think that happened in some ways. What Cambridge Analytica did, for people that remember that, was it was, I think, a moment in time when what the public took out of that was, I had no idea how much of my data was gathered by these companies. I had no idea they could do it without my consent. I had no idea it extended to, they probably thought, I know there's a transactional relationship that I have with an app that's free because, you know, they get my data about what I do when I use their app. They had no idea that data was being gathered about other activities on other apps on the same device. And then that this data and information could not just be used commercially by the company, but could then be, could end up in the hands of bad people, like Alexander Nixon, Cambridge Analytica, and I think that was a moment then where, and then also what actually, for those of you who've read Nick Clegg's book on how to save the internet, I think what's interesting there is he sort of says of the tech clash that it was born out of a culture of denial and avoidance of scrutiny on behalf of the platforms. And I think all of those things were prevalent at that time. And I think people really picked up on that. And then it became people's own experiences of, I remember in Parliament, again, around this sort of time, you had people who'd had a family there'd been a tragedy in the family, maybe the loss of a daughter to suicide as a consequence of content they'd seen on social media tools, and the difficulty of making any kind of progress with that. There was also a small British company called Foundem that pursued a case against search case against Google as well, which ultimately they won in the European Court. But and again, the kind of highly defensive nature of trying to get any kind of information out of the companies about these cases, even to discuss them openly, their reluctance to appear in front of committees when they were called, when they did, the kind of stonewalling tactics they brought. I think all these things sort of like came together and made people think, well, maybe there's something in this, maybe there are real problems, and there was an appetite to explore them. With safety, it was easier because there are tragedies, there is loss of life, there is incitement to race hate. There are things that people can clearly understand and see. The challenge with DMCC was trying to unpack a lot of complex relationships between these gatekeepers and the businesses that traded through them, and to explain how what the digital economy was a series of silos that were being dominated by one or two players. That this wasn't the case that somehow these companies all compete against each other. I mean, as Peter Thiel has said, competition is for losers. You define your market silo and you dominate it to the exclusion of everyone else. Anyone who's trading in a competitive market is not making very much money doing it. So let's not believe that they are interested in competition. They're interested in maximizing their profits. But as legislators, public policy people, we should care about this because there is a clear detriment that hurts consumers and other businesses.
And so it was against this backdrop that you were having conversations with your colleagues, drafting or thinking these were the origins, the genesis of what we now know as the UK sort of digital rules. Can you take us through the sort of the conversations that you were having, the process, and where we are heading, where we are and where we are heading?
Yeah, well, with online safety, that was really about the principle of defining what the regulations should be, what the liabilities and responsibilities of a company should be, how they should be enforced, and that you had an independent regulator that established those codes and would oversee them and implement them. On competition, the Competition and Markets Authority, after the Furman Review, had already been working on this to identify through market studies evidence of market failure. So obviously there was a good discussion before lunch about mobile ecosystems, but app stores was one of the first areas where they looked at, and could then put a number on it, what they said the consumer cost was of the lack of competition in those markets, that you had two app stores that were effectively monopolies, and there was evidence of predatory pricing, unfair practices where some businesses were more favorably dealt with than others. A case I was involved with when I was chair of the select committee, we ended up publishing some sealed court papers from a court in California, which came our way. Well, actually, we summoned the person that had access to them. And that showed how Meta was using techniques to give people favorable access to metadata depending on the amount of marketing spend they put through the platform, that they were making decisions strategically to strike apps off the platform altogether. So probably the best example of those cases was their decision to strike down Vine, the short-form video app, because it was too popular and was gaining too much Facebook user data through its interface on the platform, and therefore it was killed. And so we took an interest in these cases and stories through the committee work, through the work the CMA was doing, and that really built the case for the DMCC. And when it was going through Parliament, you could cite examples of market failure and explain what it meant, and also explain what that could mean in the future. And it's so important with these regimes that they were designed to be forward-looking. They're designed not to deal with issues that affect us today, but to look at the market conditions and how they could cause harm and detriment to consumers and other businesses in the future, and therefore the regulators should be looking forward to that too.
Do you think regulators are good at doing that? I mean, there's some criticism that the regulation is still very slow, very backward looking, despite the goal.
Yeah. Well, the thing is, I mean, this desire to regulate these digital markets, it wasn't born by, out of regulators trying to find work for themselves. It was really a reaction to the demand of other businesses that felt they were victims of anti-competitive behavior, and consumers as well. You only had to see anyone who tried to buy, Oasis tickets last year, suddenly sparked a national conversation about price fluctuations, dynamic pricing on websites. So the CMA often responds to consumer campaigns or huge consumer outcry about something. And I think with digital markets, the CMA is responding to that. And I think I'm much more comfortable with us being in a place now where the biggest complaint we could levy is they're not using the powers as we thought they would. They're not being proactive enough. They're not moving quickly enough. Not that no one has got the power to act. The fact I think they have now the investigatory powers they need to go into companies to get evidence to back up claims of wrongdoing and breaches of consumer protection law and self-preferencing and other harms is really important. And I think we will only build on that. The concern you might have at the moment is, given the pressure from the United States, not will there be a walking back of regulation, but will there be a chilling effect? Pressure from the government and others not to enforce and follow through or to go slow. But I think our best guarantee against that will be where that looks like that's happening is sort of some form of public outcry about it, because they can see the harms these problems are causing and want them fixed.
So just for people who may not be aware of the legislation in the UK, can you talk us through what the key elements of the law are, and maybe what's your view in relation to the DMA? Are they very similar? Are they the same?
Well, they cover similar territory. I think the principal difference is when you've got a national regulator, you can issue codes of practice and guidance to companies in a more bespoke way that I think the European institutions can do. And I think that will prove to be helpful. I think the CMA principally sees its job in cases like this as trying to help companies comply with the obligations that they set. But crucially, when they feel that they're not getting, that the companies aren't complying, that they have investigatory powers to go into companies and demand access to data and information to back up those investigations, that failure to comply comes with criminal sanctions, evidence of clear breaches of their obligations by the companies comes with the levying of very big fines of 10% of global annual revenue. And so these are quite big tools that the CMA has at its disposal, and the Digital Markets Unit gives it the power to enforce them. And for the companies too, they should be in a position where there is no doubt as to what the regulator expects them to do and not do, and that they are open to investigation if they fail. And so my hope is that as this regime beds in, and of course it's only been fully active this year, is that we'll see a good working relationship, but also the CMA demonstrating it is willing to use its investigatory and enforcement powers when it needs to.
But is it, because you mentioned politics, and we have the pressure obviously from the US on Europe, but in the UK in particular, we have a government with a pro-growth agenda, and critics that we speak to are very concerned that they see a regulator that is essentially not doing too much. And when it's doing something, it's very, very little with little consequences.
Well, yeah, and I can understand those fears. And as the previous chair of the CMA is in the room, I'll sort of, the fact it was the Chancellor of the Exchequer sort of suggested he was removed from his job because he was too likely to use his powers. That was an outrageous thing to have been said. But I also think as well, if there's any, it's interesting. We've had 2 rounds of trade negotiations with the Americans now, both which have been consequential with agreements in place. And there has been no public declaration that suggests a watering down or rolling back of digital regulation, either through the DMCC or through the Online Safety Act. Now, we have to be vigilant.
Sure, politically they won't do it like that, right? There's other ways that you can.
The other ways would be there is a kind of a chilling effect of lack of enforcement or lack of investigation, or go slow on AI regulation as well. But I also think that the case needs to be made and restated as to why we need regulations in these markets, and who they're there to protect. Sometimes the tech companies like to say, well, because the individual consumer cost is quite small, and if anything, the pressure of innovation in the tech space is reducing the cost of things, is there really any evidence of detriment? But there is, and the CMA has priced that, but also the effect that has on other businesses that increasingly are required to trade through gatekeepers, is something we should be concerned about. And I think we're focused on, things like the app stores, this has been discussed today, but these market conditions apply just as much to things like broadcasting and music distribution. There was a big backlash in the UK media around the government's consultation on the copyright exception for AI and the impact that would have on creative businesses that distribute their wares across the internet, where that can be scraped for data and commercially exploited by another party without their consent, without any requirement for them to make any kind of compensation for it. Now, there was a big public debate about that, and rightly so. And I also think we'll see it with our public broadcasters in the next couple of years as we go through the process of renewing the BBC's charter, but also thinking about what does television mean when effectively we have media convergence into smart devices of all broadcast content, but be it on demand or live broadcasts. What does that mean for the future of public broadcasting? Are people really going to say, well, we've got to give YouTube a free pass on all of this, and even if we've got to pick up the pieces for the damage it will cause others? I don't think that's going to be the outcome. So there's an inevitability to this, but you have to keep on restating the case, making that publicly, and hoping you get the public response to back you up.
Excellent, very good. We have about 5-6 minutes, and I want to check if there's anyone with a question to Damian before he needs to leave. Yes, okay, can we get the mic? Thank you so much.
I wonder if you have anything to say by way of prediction about the future of mechanisms to protect children from inappropriate conduct. The classic situation where the porn site asks for details, that's not a great solution. Father's driving license. There's a bunch of different ways of doing it. And I just wonder if you know how extremely delicate all these matters are and how difficult it is to find a way that actually works, which does not have too many downsides. Do you have any thoughts?
Well, in terms of the principle of should we do it or not, so should we repeal the Online Safety Act, as Nigel Farage has called for and as J.D. Vance would like us to do? I think that's very unlikely. I think the idea that we say, you know what, Mark Zuckerberg can keep on pushing self-harm and suicide content at teenage girls because his systems tell him that if he does that, he makes more money doing it than not. And he can do that with impunity, make as much money as he likes. It's none of our business. No one's going to accept that. I mean, we've crossed that. I think we've crossed that Rubicon. So the question is, in terms of the enforcement of some of the safety standards, is there a debate around some of those mechanisms? For sure there is. And the way Ofcom phased that in this year, I don't think made that task easier. What's interesting, that people have done it. Even X, I thought the big first battle we would have would be on X just refusing to comply, but they haven't. I mean, what I'd like Ofcom to move to quicker is a review of whether the systems people have put in place work well or not. The moment they're going after companies that are refusing to comply, like 4chan at all, I can understand why they're doing that. So, but even the fact that companies like X have introduced adult age gating for adult content on their platform, I think is the right thing to do. It's also the right thing to do to say to companies, if you say your app should only be used by people who are a certain age or older, be that 14 or older, why do you let younger children use it? You don't just let them self-certify, but you probably, from the data you gather about that user account, know exactly how old they are, and in cases there has been evidence of advertising being targeted at children younger than 14 on platforms. So again, the regulator has got the power to hold them to account for that. I think some of the implementation has been a bit rocky, but I think these are steps that we've taken that we won't come back from. I think that the challenge of the future will be about enforcement and whether the companies are doing enough and doing well enough. And I think Ofcom should use its powers to bring in experts as well. I think one of the powers they have, but both regulators have, is to seek expert guidance and expert investigators to come in and extract the information they need. And this slightly stretches your question, but on AI, I would just say as well, I think whatever we get to on AI, I think it is very difficult to predetermine whether an AI is high risk or low risk. But what there has to be is a mechanism of liability and accountability, for the companies and the designers of these systems. It can't be an excuse to say, well, it's not us who is doing it, it's the user, or it's not us, it's the piece of AI. There has to be that level of accountability. But I think we won't go back, is my.
I have a question, actually more big picture philosophical. I often wonder in these debates, legislation, enforcement, etc., we talk about the consumer a lot, and do you think that there's an awareness, in this case in the British consumer users of the internet, of the harms of all these things that we're discussing? It feels like it's easy for a government to just step back, not enforce anything now against the backlash of the US, and just let things sort of slide a bit.
Well, I think, again, with DMCC, the issues are often less emotive, and the consumer may be less aware of why their user experience is, why they are being charged what they're being charged in an app store. As far as they're concerned, if the price is relatively low and it's accessible, then is that enough for them? There will be issues when they think the design of the services they use is going to change in the future, or the range of availability they have may change in the future. I think that is something they will be concerned about. But this is where the role of companies is so important. When I was a minister, an organisation that actually Geradin has worked with, the Coalition for App Fairness, was incredibly helpful. And it really brought home to me why doing this was so important. Because when you have big businesses saying, we'll explain to you the problems that we've had working with the gatekeeper platform in this room, but we will not say it publicly because the detriment to our business will be so significant. If we criticize them publicly, we can't do it, but we can tell you what the problems are. That is really powerful, and it's really important that those conversations continue, because if you want to safeguard against a go slow, a chilling effect on enforcement, it's going to be because the case is not being made readily enough about why it's so necessary and what the harm is going to be. And if you want to say we want to go for growth, well, growth for who? Is it growth for 5 companies, or is it growth for the whole economy? If you say, do we have regulation? Well, there is regulation. It's a question of, is the regulation designed by the gatekeepers, or is it designed by independent regulators? But there's going to be regulation one way or the other. And that's what we have to keep in mind.
Excellent. Damian, thank you so much for your time. I really enjoyed the conversation.